This week, Alberta moved first on a First Nations-backed West Coast pipeline, committing funds and a technical advisory group to shepherd an application towards Ottawa while promising Indigenous co-ownership from the start. Alberta's teachers, meanwhile, voted overwhelmingly to strike next week after nearly 9 in 10 rejected the province's latest deal. And in Calgary's mayoral race, Jeromy Farkas used a Reddit Ask Me Anything to float hate tracking programs and pushed back on the province's use of the notwithstanding clause on youth gender policy. Alberta separatists touted a second round of Washington, D.C. meetings with senior figures in the Trump administration, while Premier Danielle Smith reiterated that her goal is a strong, sovereign Alberta within Canada. All that and more on this week's Alberta Roundup. I'm your host, Isaac Lamoureux, and let's jump right into that first story. Alberta says it will take the lead in advancing a new West Coast oil pipeline proposal, at least through the early pre-application phase, by funding a technical advisory group alongside Indigenous partners and 3 pipeline companies. The province will act as a proponent until a formal application is approved, with the expectation that private investors will assume ownership and risk from there. Premier Danielle Smith said the approach centers Indigenous co-ownership and leadership from the outset and targets a formal application to be submitted by spring 2026. Smith said, quote, "This project application is about more than a pipeline. It's about unlocking Canada's full economic potential. Together, we are charting a path to secure Canada's energy future for generations while bringing the world's most ethically and responsibly produced energy to market." Despite Smith's enthusiasm, though, BC NDP Premier David Eby immediately rejected the idea, arguing that it would be subsidized by taxpayers even beyond Alberta. He said, quote, "This proposal comes at the expense of the real private sector projects that are going to lift our economy and lift the national economy." Alberta's Deputy Minister of Energy and Minerals, though, Larry Kalmeyer, stressed that the province does not intend to own the pipeline. He said, quote, "We are not in the process of having Alberta taxpayers on the hook for owning a pipeline." The province is committing $14 million for early planning, which is route assessment, engineering, cost estimates, and Indigenous engagement, with an application to be filed to the Federal Major Projects Office under Building Canada Act around spring 2026. Officials said the province's involvement at this stage reflects federal and regulatory hurdles, like the tanker ban, that have stymied past projects such as Energy East, Northern Gateway, and Keystone XL. Smith argued that had those projects proceeded, Canada's GDP would be $55 billion higher every year, and energy officials noted that $11.5 billion in capital moved from Canada to the US over the past 3 months. Smith tied the entire project to national unity. In fact, one of her quotes was so powerful, I'll actually just let you take a quick listen to that.
Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of pushback here. We already have the Premier to the west of us calling this not realistic, essentially a distraction. So how do you plan to deal with some of the opponents to this project, whether it's the Premier next door, whether it's some of these Indigenous groups, whether it's just activists who don't want a pipeline?
So I will continue, as I said, to work to build the coalition of partners who are going to be on board with this. But this is a Canada project, and this is a test of whether Canada works as a country. Because if we can't build with collaboration of the federal government and between provinces, if it's everybody gets to get their products going to market except Alberta, that's not a country. A country is one where we support each other. And I think Canadians are there, and I hope that we can get more and more politicians to get there too.
Energy Minister Brian Jean linked the proposal to Canada's global ambitions. He said, quote, "We already see Canada as an energy powerhouse, and with the right infrastructure, moving towards superpower status is both realistic and achievable. Planning will scope the route, the size, the costs, and Indigenous engagement to assess national interest." Officials said that the pipeline will be 42 inches in diameter, and it will go to BC's west coast, and it could move up to 1 million barrels per day, with potential endpoints being Prince Rupert or Kitimat. Alberta focused, of course, a lot on Indigenous co-ownership and collaboration during this announcement. Minister of Indigenous Relations Rajan Sawhney said, quote, "Alberta's government is committed to respectful, transparent engagement that recognizes Indigenous communities as rights holders, leaders, and owners in the prosperity we build together." And various Indigenous leaders voiced support. For example, Fort McKay First Nation Chief Raymond Powder said, quote, "By working together with government and industry, we can create opportunities that strengthen our communities while showcasing the incredible potential of Alberta's energy sector." And then the National Coalition of Chiefs President Dale Swampy called ownership opportunities a driver of economic reconciliation. He said, quote, "We are happy that Alberta is leading an effort to get another pipeline to the West Coast, and we are especially happy that they have decided to engage with Indigenous nations in BC and Alberta right from the very beginning of the process." The technical advisory group includes Southbow, Enbridge, and Trans Mountain, plus senior Indigenous and industry leaders such as Cenovus Executive Chair Alex Pourbaix, former Enbridge CEO Al Monaco, and more. Alberta noted that Canada is the world's fourth largest producer with the fourth largest oil reserves, and crude exports actually climbed from $6 billion in 2000 to $130 billion in 2024. The line is said to meet growing Asian demand in places like Japan, China, Korea, and even India. Smith said that she hopes the project is actually on Ottawa's next major project list by the Grey Cup in November. But for our next story, we'll move on to the teachers' strike because Alberta will see its first province-wide teacher strike in more than 2 decades after 89.5% of teachers rejected the government's latest offer, with a walkout scheduled for October 6th. And despite a mediator-recommended settlement and a second agreement negotiated and agreed upon by the Teachers Employer Bargaining Association and the Alberta Teachers Association, teachers rejected both, prompting the province to roll out direct supports for families and learning at home. Premier Danielle Smith said the offer on the table was exceptionally strong. She said, quote, "To say I'm disappointed is an understatement. What was offered to Alberta's educators is very generous and was the highest general wage increase proposed in over a decade." She added that the province gave teachers everything they demanded and more, including hiring 3,000 new teachers and 1,500 educational assistants over 3 years, a 12% salary increase, with actually over 95% of the teachers would have seen a 17% increase, and a top category salary rising to $114,800. Smith said, quote, "That's the best in Western Canada in a province with lower taxes and no sales taxes," noting it is higher than British Columbia, which obviously has a much higher cost of living. In fact, here's what Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Chris Sims, had to say. Take a listen.
I was surprised when the Premier said that the level 5 or whatever that is, level 5 teacher is paid $114,800 per year if they had accepted this offer. Highest paid teachers in Western Canada if they had accepted this offer. On top of that, the province of Alberta is promising to hire 3,000 new teachers plus 1,500 classroom assistants, all while we're facing down a huge debt of about $84 billion. Yeah, that sounded like a pretty darn generous offer. Teachers should really stop and think and ask themselves. Think of that pay increase, okay? 3% per year for the next 4 years. Think of your workplaces where you get to go to work that is clean and safe and everybody's looking up to you as the smartest person in the room. Think about the time you get off. Think of the holidays that you have. And then compare that to other workers in Alberta. They're in a pretty good situation compared to a lot of other workers in this province, frankly. And the Alberta teachers should accept a deal. This is a pretty generous deal.
In a Facebook post, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation broke it down pretty well, actually, saying, quote, "Here's the pay grid the Alberta teachers rejected by 89.5%. Imagine being 22 years old, straight out of teachers college, and you start at $71,000. Less than 10 years experience, and you're already making $110,000, plus benefits, pension, day shifts, vacation, summers, secure job, etc. Province offered 12% over 4 years, plus hiring 3,000 new teachers, plus hiring 1,500 new education assistants. Why did they reject this very generous offer? What's going on with this?" And it seems like no one knows. Finance Minister Nate Horner said the government had increased its offer yet again. He said, quote, "We put $2.6 billion on the table, $300 million more than our spring offer, and the teachers still rejected it." Let's also remember that the offer that the teachers just rejected was put forward last week by the ATA and accepted by TEBA. I have to say, I'm left questioning what it is exactly the teachers want. I believe it is harmful for the union to strike without clearly understanding and presenting what their members are looking for. He maintained the package would have made Alberta's teachers, again, the highest paid in Western Canada after taxes. But to mitigate the impact on families, the province is stepping up while the teachers step aside, and it will provide $150 per week per student to parents of children 12 years old and under in public, separate, or francophone schools affected by the strike. According to the government, the payments will be funded through redirected unused education grants and unspent teacher salaries during the strike here, so eligible parents and guardians can begin preparing on the provincial website. The first payment will be made October 31st if the strike proceeds. Education Minister Dimitrios Nicolaides also unveiled a free parent toolkit to keep learning on track at home. He said, quote, "The toolkit provides a week-by-week guide for parents to follow the Alberta curriculum. It covers core subjects, offers practice materials, and will be updated weekly in English and French." But even without a ratified agreement, Nicolaides said the government will proceed with $300 million to hire at least 1,500 educational assistants over the next 3 years. Smith also highlighted $8.6 billion in school construction funding to build 130 new schools and add 200,000 student spaces by 2030. She pointed to the extraordinary enrollment growth, with, of course, more than 80,000 new students in the past 3 years as the system's primary pressure point. Smith said, quote, "We just simply have a space restriction. We just had 100,000 kids almost come into the system in 3 years, and we have a physical space restriction that we are working through." The province has linked enrollment pressures to federal immigration trends. Smith previously, of course, criticized the Liberals' reckless immigration policies, and Immigration Minister Joseph Scow similarly said they had lost control of sustainable immigration in Canada. Alberta has grown faster than any other province in Canada over the last several years, partially due to repeatedly leading the country in interprovincial migration. And some of the teachers seem to be realizing this, that it's enrollment that is causing the issues, but maybe they aren't just coming to the evident point that it's immigration is the problem. As for our next story, we'll hop into a mayoral race because Calgary mayoral candidate Jeromy Farkas used a schedule Reddit Ask Me Anything to promote a hate tracking initiative, opposed Alberta's efforts to enforce its ban on child gender transitions and other woke policies. So framing his platform as fiscally conservative but supportive of vulnerable populations, Farkas said his plan includes hate tracking and education programs, culturally competent training for first responders, and the housing equity roadmap to ensure our housing system works for racialized, newcomers, Indigenous, disabled, and 2S LGBTQ residents. A campaign policy brief repeated the pledge to invest in community-led education and hate tracking. And on reconciliation, Farkas said Mayor Jyoti Gondek deserves real credit, vowing to continue partnerships in housing and land use. He declined to support the province's use of the notwithstanding clause on gender policy, writing, quote, "I do not support that use of the notwithstanding clause," and suggesting such decisions should be left to municipalities. Pressed about alleged association with racism, bigotry, and xenophobia, Farkas replied, quote, "I've never associated myself with that kind of garbage," pointing to a past Pride-themed Wild Rose Parade logo when he was a constituency association president. He added he has promoted a pro-immigration message for Calgary. On transit safety and affordability, Farkas called for more safety ambassadors and better lighting and visibility at stations. He backed former Mayor Naheed Nenchi's mental health and addiction strategy, saying, quote, "I've backed efforts like culturally competent safety training and restoring liaison officers so BIPOC and newcomer communities feel represented and protected." True North's previous exclusive polling showed Farkas leading overall among mayoral candidates in Calgary at 31.08% support, with 39.4% support among those who voted Conservative in the 2025 federal election. Of course, Sonia Sharp was in second at 22.5%. Despite the province taking a stand against bike lanes and transportation, Minister Devon Dreeshen, of course, previously celebrated Gondek when she called the bike lanes temporary, Farkas might take a different approach. He said, quote, "If the provincial government wants us to stay out of their lane, they should stay out of ours," and also advocated for lowering speed limits. One of the users on the AMA asked Farkas what he would do if he was given $100 million to spend on Calgary tomorrow. And Farkas said, quote, "I'd launch a social sector surge by partnering with nonprofits, governments, and donors to stretch every dollar." Yeah, that sounds real conservative. Farkas highlighted his years of support for the Pride community, citing the challenges facing the gender and sexually diverse community here. He also discussed his stance on pandemic lockdowns, advocating for masking, and even saying he required his team to do so. True North reached out to Farkas's campaign for clarification but did not receive a response. For our next story, we'll look over to the separatists because the Alberta Prosperity Project leadership, that being lawyer Jeffrey Rath, CEO Mitch Sylvester, and Chair Dennis Modry, completed a second round of meetings in Washington, D.C. with what they called very senior representatives of the U.S. administration, and they claimed momentum for Alberta independence. Rath said, quote, "Recognition of Alberta as an independent country and complete free trade with the USA with zero tariffs on all goods and services are all on the table when Albertans vote to leave Canada." He also argued that support for independence appears stronger in Washington than from Premier Danielle Smith, claiming even a supermajority of her UCP members back separation. Rath separately wrote, quote, "The interest in Alberta independence is palpable. We all agree that Alberta must be freed from the destructive forces of the communist Chinese-adjacent Canadian government in Ottawa." Premier Danielle Smith responded at an unrelated press conference, repeating her position that her 10 Alberta Next panel town halls and online surveys. Smith said, quote, "My objective is to have a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada. That's what I've been working with the federal government under its new leadership to try and get a grand bargain, as I've been calling it, to get a new bitumen pipeline to the coast, the Pathways Project, and address the 9 bad laws." Of course, we know Smith previously issued 9 demands for Prime Minister Mark Carney to complete within his first 6 months to avoid an unprecedented national unity crisis. Well, the 6 months have passed, and Carney has not followed through on any of them. A billboard campaign, in fact, recently gave Carney failing or low marks on several items, which was an F on repealing the single-use plastics ban, a C on pausing the net zero vehicle mandate, and an F- on repealing legislation that censors energy companies. That was its Alberta scorecard. And the Alberta Prosperity Project has been spearheading a petition to force a referendum on separation, of course, with the question being, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? The petition, however, remains stalled, pending a constitutional review ordered by the Alberta Court of King's Bench earlier this year. Because as we know, in August, the Court of King's Bench Justice Colin Feasby ruled the referendum question requires a full constitutional review, with a decision expected by year's end. Smith had previously pledged to allow Albertans to vote on separation in 2026 if the required numbers of signatures were collected. However, she recently said she was doing everything in her power to prevent a referendum vote, a comment that drew criticism from the independence movement. Of course, this comment was in response to Lukaszik's petition, but she didn't specify that. While former Cabinet Minister Thomas Lukaszik's petition must proceed under the old rules due to an early filing blunder, which of course is going to require him to collect 293,976,000 signatures in 90 days, the Alberta Prosperity Projects would proceed under the new threshold of 177,000 over 120 days. However, Republican Party of Alberta leader Cam Davies previously told True North that Bill 54 was why the Alberta Prosperity Project's petition was held up in court. He said, quote, "Bill 54 had a number of tripwire and pitfalls contained. There was no requirement until the UCP placed that requirement in Bill 54 for the courts to intervene and make sure that it passed the federal sniff test. It was never her intention to allow this question to come to a vote. It has always been the Premier's intention to disturb, stifle, and ensure that this vote never comes about." The Alberta Prosperity Project's 44-page costed fiscal plan highlighted Alberta's economic future under independence. The plan projects that an independent Alberta would generate $4.71 trillion in revenue between 2025 and 2045, save nearly $700 billion, create 300,000 to 450,000 jobs, and invest $1.3 to $1.4 trillion in the Heritage Fund. But that wraps up this week's Alberta Roundup. My name's Isaac Lamoureux. Have a great weekend. Thank you, and God bless.